In my last video, I talked about how men should be the leader in a relationship. If you want to check that out, I'm going to link it over here. But in today's video, I want to talk about whether or not a woman should lead the relationship. And is it a viable option? Personally, I don't think it's a good idea for a woman to lead the relationship. And I'm going to talk about a few instances where I think it's probably okay for a woman to lead and some of the consequences of making that choice. Biologically speaking, we are programmed with certain instincts and desires that were put there through evolution. Men and women behave differently according to our biology. But of course, it's not purely biological because otherwise men and women would act exactly the same all over the world across all cultures. But that's not the case. There's a huge amount of cultural and social variations. So it's a mix of nature and nurture. This is important because in my last video, I said that men should lead the relationship because it is more closely aligned with our biological nature. If you ask women what they're looking for in men, they'll say things like good decision making, leadership quality, status. That's what they are attracted to, and that's what masculinity is. Women are feminine, so they are attracted to masculine. So evolution has crafted men and women specifically for these traits. Men tend to be better at looking at the big picture, so when leading the relationship, they tend to look at things like, what is our 5-year plan? How much are we spending this month? What kind of investments should we have? You see, that is a very practical and logical mindset to have in a relationship. However, for women, they are a lot better at smaller details. They notice things around the house and in their lives that men are completely oblivious to. This is one of their strengths. This is why men need women, because women are picking up on things that men are clueless about. So we get a good mix of the big picture and smaller details. To say that one is more important than the other is completely missing the point of cooperation. Now, I understand that when we talk about who's the leader and who's the follower in a relationship, it can give a false sense of hierarchy. But men leading in a relationship doesn't mean in like a dictatorship or in like a tyranny kind of way. What it really means is that the man takes on a larger amount of responsibility so that the woman doesn't have to. Perhaps he gets a little bit more freedom because he gets to dictate how things go, but that responsibility, that burden of always having to look out for everyone else's needs, that is something that he assumes for her sake. Well, somebody has to do it, so as a man, it is more natural to be in that position. And this is what I think a healthy relationship looks like. Now let's talk about a deviation from this dynamic where the woman takes on the leadership position in the relationship. Whenever this happens, I can think of two types of deviation. The first being biological. For whatever reason, the woman is just hardwired to want to take on that responsibility. She wants that leadership role. And there are men who are just not born to do that. Why evolution has selected for this possibility, I'm not sure. Possibly could be a unique combination of genetics. But even though they are deviated from what's normally expected, there's actually nothing wrong with them. In this situation, if a man and woman find each other, they can make it work. I believe that this absolutely exists. However, these individuals are so rare that they don't really apply to the general population. This brings me to my second deviation, that is, any woman with a desire to take on that responsibility in the leadership position. I believe that is not because of genetics or evolution, rather than psychological issues that are causing them to be in denial of their true impulses. For example, you might see a woman wanting to be in charge of a relationship, but it could be because she witnessed her father being a terrible leader, like a drunk or an abusive person sexually assaulting everyone in the family. Having to experience that at such a young age, she could internalize the message that whenever you have a man in charge, that is an absolute nightmare. So she made a decision to always be the one in charge. Now it would take a step back and look at this scenario. This might feel authentic to her, but this psychological trauma has caused her to go against her biological desires. If we were to take away all that trauma, she could very well be a traditional woman who wants to play the supportive role instead of always wanting to be in charge. Now let's take the man's perspective. He might be raised by radical feminist single woman who hates men and always complaining about men. So the boy growing up internalizing the message that his masculinity is inherently toxic. He is terrified of making any decisions because he doesn't want to become the kind of man that his mother always complains about. So he only feels safe when he is in a relationship where the woman is making all the decisions. Now he might meet the woman that I was just talking about earlier, and they might have something of a relationship that works. It's possible. But do you see how that's not natural? That's not really two people's true natures coming together. What you see is two people coping together because of their psychological trauma. And this dynamic certainly has consequences because who knows how long that's going to last. It might work in the short term, but over time, as she resolves her psychological trauma, she's going to need that coping mechanism less and less. And eventually, she'll get in touch with her own nature and start craving some positive masculinity. She'll need somebody to take charge of a relationship, and if a man cannot do that, she'll lose attraction for him. Or it could be that she's not a very consistent individual. There's a part of her that wants to be in charge, but that doesn't mean that she has completely shut down all the other instincts that crave some male leadership. So she feels safe whenever she's in charge, but she also resents the guy for giving her that responsibility. This kind of relationship cannot work. Now, if you think this sounds ridiculous, like why would you want to be in the leadership position, but at the same time you don't want any responsibility? Let me tell you, this kind of relationship is very common. We all have the capacity for contradictions. You can think or feel certain emotions that you know you shouldn't feel based on your value system, but it's possible for those contradictions to exist simultaneously, and you or your partner might have the worst of it. This is my last point. Let's just assume that the woman wants to be the leader and the man wants to be the follower, and you can make it work. You have a healthy relationship. What about the children? This is the choice that you've made, but when you bring children into this dynamic, they're going to look up to you as role models for their future relationships. So if you have built your relationship based on a coping mechanism, but your children don't need those coping mechanisms, they're going to look at this dynamic between masculinity and femininity, and it's going to be very confusing for them because they feel that their biological instincts are not being demonstrated in the real world right in front of them. Now, I can say that it might not be such a big problem if you are explicit about it and you educate your children so they don't grow up too confused. Because I think it is a terrible idea to have a son growing up without any role model of masculinity. So if you are a man and you don't feel comfortable stepping into that masculine leadership role, it is still your job to provide that masculinity in some other ways. Maybe there's an uncle, or you can put him in Boy Scouts, in sports club, just something so he can model after. Anyways, that's all I have. This is why I don't think it's a good idea for a woman to take on that leadership position, because she has to take on that burden of responsibility that can really shy her away from her true femininity. Those that do have the desire to be in the leadership position, most of the time it stems from psychological trauma that's causing them to be in denial of their true impulses. I think it's more natural for men to take on that responsibility in the leadership position. I made an entire video explaining why men should be in the leadership position. If you want to check that out, I'm going to leave it somewhere here. Until next time, stay curious.